I want to do a short video on troubleshooting an issue I just had with this boat. Really was odd. It took me a while to solve, so I wanted to give an explanation for how I figured out what it was and how to fix it. This is a 2008 Mercury 75 EFI engine. All the EFI Mercury engines could have this issue because they all have some common parts on them. This particular engine, there's a 50, a 75, and a 90 horse version of these engines that are identical. But even up to like the 250 or 300 horse Verados use the same fuel system. So this could theoretically happen on any of the Mercury engines. This engine was idling extremely rough. It ran perfectly fine. Then on the next startup, it was running extremely rough. It was very sudden and abrupt. The engine was barely able to run. It wouldn't take any throttle, and there was a ton of smoke and extra gas coming out of the exhaust, the unburnt gas. So it seemed like it was misfiring. And I did the usual process of trying to diagnose a bad coil pack, where with the engine running, you unplug your coils one at a time to try to find out which cylinder is not firing. And it turned out that these two cylinders both were not firing. And it would be extremely rare for two coil packs to fail at the same time. So I took these coils off. Actually, I took all four of them off. Took the spark plugs out and cranked the engine over. And I was getting a huge amount of gasoline spraying out of the bottom two cylinders. More out of this one, slightly more or slightly less out of this one, and just the normal amount kind of out of here that you would expect from the injectors. But really this was shooting like a huge stream of gas out of the the spark plug hole. Next thing I did was unhook the injectors. So your injectors are normally closed unless they get a signal to open them. And so by disconnecting the electrical connector on all your injectors, you're verifying that they're all shut, or they should be shut unless they're mechanically stuck open. And then after I disconnected them all, I started cranking the engine again, and I was getting the exact same thing, just a huge amount of gas coming out of these two. Now these two are on the bottom, so that's worth noting, is that these cylinders, gravity is bringing all the gasoline to these two cylinders. So the culprit wound up being the fuel box. Here's the intake manifold. It comes back here. We'll walk around the other side. This is the fuel box. And this fuel box has fuel pumps in it. There's a lift pump to take gasoline out of the tank. There's another high pressure pump which pressurizes the fuel system. And there's a fuel pressure regulator in there that uses a vacuum signal to adjust the fuel pressure depending on how much throttle you're giving the boat. And the fuel pressure regulator and these two pumps sit in a bath of gasoline. So this thing is full of gasoline, and the fuel pump that's pumping gas out of the tank is actually putting some pressure inside of this box. And you'll notice here's a hose. So there's a bunch of connections on here for fuel lines, but this is not a fuel line. This is a vacuum line. This hose right here comes out of the fuel box and comes over to this side, and it plugs into the intake manifold right in there. So you could take that line off and cycle the key, and in my case, gasoline would spray out of that line. So the question is, how does that happening? So it could have been two things, really, if you think about it. The fuel pressure regulator has a diaphragm in it, and the diaphragm has vacuum on one side and gasoline on the other. And if the diaphragm were to rupture, then gasoline could pass through and come into or cross over into the vacuum system. The other could be the vacuum line itself, and that, in my case, that's what the problem was. So you can take the fuel box out pretty easy. There's a couple hoses down here you have to take off. You disconnect the power wires for the fuel pumps, take the fuel lines off the top, take the vacuum line off, and then there's 3 bolts. There's one here, one right there, and one on the bottom. Take those 3 bolts out, and then you can take this fuel box off of the engine. Once you have it out of the boat, you can take these bolts that are on top. This holds the fuel housing together, and you can lift or separate the two halves. So this container on the bottom comes off, and then the fuel pumps and the fuel pressure regulator are all attached to the lid, and they come out the top. And once I had it apart, I could see the vacuum line that connects the fuel pressure regulator inside the box had a hole in it, and it was split. And so the fuel pressure that was inside this tank was being pushed into that vacuum hose, through this vacuum hose, and flooding the intake manifold. And because the motor sits vertically, all the gas from gravity pulling it down was in these two runners. Super easy fix, kind of difficult. Sorry, I got traffic going by. It was a super easy fix and cheap, but it was a bit difficult to find. Certainly that fuel box arrangement is a little bit unique to Mercury. But anyway, I hope this video helps you.